The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was released in 2023 to absolute critical acclaim from the critics. As far as players go, I'd say that the reception has been all over the place. I've seen opinions range from the game is just a shitty DLC to it's the greatest game ever made. Most people, including myself, ended up liking the game but still felt disappointed. To be fair, it's a really tough task to try to follow up a game like Breath of the Wild, and most people's expectations were definitely high for that reason. If you're interested to hear my thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom, you can check my review I did on it a few months ago, but that video is a bit hard to watch now since it's over 2 hours long and I was still using my old mic. It's also on my other channel, so I'll leave the link in the description if you're interested. I'll use this video to add on to that review, mainly about things I've had time to think about and put into words since then. I also want to give some thoughts about potential future games following this last one. If you're not interested in watching it, the TLDR is the only things I think were truly improved on were the narrative, yes, it has a better story than Breath of the Wild, the side quests, and the dungeons slightly. Everything else is either the same or worse overall. I won't go into details about all of this, as I've already done so in my review, but as a whole, these were my thoughts after doing every side adventure, shrine, and exploring the whole map. No, I didn't 100% it, and to say that I'm not even remotely interested in doing so would be a gigantic understatement. Nintendo then announced sometime later in 2023 that the Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom formula would be the template for future Zelda games from here on out, or at least until they reinvent the formula is my guess. Just like with Tears of the Kingdom, the reaction to this announcement has been mixed, with a lot of people saying they want a real Zelda again. Of course, that begs the question, what is a real Zelda? The series has been around for almost 40 years now. It started in 1986 on the NES and has had a mainline release anywhere between 1 to 6 years of one another. Naturally, the series has evolved a lot over time. When you go from the original Legend of Zelda to Tears of the Kingdom and you look at everything in between, all of these games offer a different experience from one another. Oracle of Ages, for example, is nothing like Breath of the Wild. These two might be the least alike games in the series, yet they're both part of it. Despite that, it's very hard to say that any of these games are truly bad. Zelda is one of the most consistent game series in terms of quality over time. This is why tier lists or rankings of these games vary so much from person to person. Ask any fan of the series what their ranking looks like, and it'll be nothing like any other. Plus, I guarantee you any Zelda fan will be extremely happy to share it with you, it'll make their day. Even though these games offer a pretty different experience from one another, you can still tell a Zelda game when you see one, or play one. There's a reason why we can say games like Star Fox Adventures or 3D Dot Game Heroes are Zelda clones or Zelda-like games. It's because they feature a lot of the core elements of a Zelda game. Of course, that begs the question, what are these elements exactly? The answer you get will vary from person to person, but I believe we can separate these core elements into 6 different categories. First off, we have the dungeons. These are pretty self-explanatory. They're the different levels or segments of the game, which are challenge areas with a reward at the end, usually tied to the main quest. I would also include anything regarding puzzles in this category, as this is where the vast majority of them are. The second one is the story. This is also self-evident. It's the story, it's the plot and the characters. It's your reason to play the game. I'm also going to include lore in here, as plenty of people also would, and it's something a lot of fans care about. The third one is exploration. Of course, this includes the overworld, but I'm also counting everything regarding side quests. Exploration is basically most of the side content every game has to offer. The fourth one is the combat. This includes regular enemies, but also bosses, as I've always thought of them separately from the dungeons they're usually found in. The fifth one is the items, which are the different, usually permanent abilities you acquire throughout the game that can help you out in combat, but also to solve puzzles and explore the world. These 5 elements on their own, I think most people would agree represent all of the core elements of a Zelda game well enough, but I would like to add a final category, which could go in any of them really, which I'm just gonna call the unique feature. You can call it many other things. It's the central gimmick, the defining attribute, the cherry on top, the je ne sais quoi, the X factor. Basically the one thing that separates a game from all the others of the series and makes it stand out. The one thing that when you come back to it years later makes you go, oh yeah, this game had this in it, or oh yeah, you could do that in this game. That's pretty neat. Of course, not every single one of these games puts emphasis into each of these elements equally, and I don't think they have to be good. I would even suggest that none of them really do. For reference, let's go back to the 2 games I talked about earlier as examples, Oracle of Ages and Breath of the Wild. Ages puts most of its content towards its items and dungeons, then puts some but definitely less emphasis on its story, its time travel mechanic being its unique feature, and its exploration, and barely any into its combat. Breath of the Wild puts most of its content into its exploration with its post-apocalyptic open world and environmental storytelling, which the latter I'd say is its unique feature, then a decently good emphasis on combat and story, and not so much into its dungeon and items, especially if you don't include the shrines as part of the dungeon content. It's not to say that the things I mentioned which aren't as present in those games don't exist at all, or that they're bad per se, they're just not the main focus of their respective game, and there's nothing wrong with that. These 2 games just offer different experiences. I could give other examples for each of these categories, but for those of us who have played the majority of these games, or even just the 3D ones, they're pretty obvious. A game with 4 dungeons has a lot less emphasis on them than one with 12, and a game with a million cutscenes has more emphasis on story than one whose plot is bad guy steals girl. Also, just like it's true that a game with less emphasis on items, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad, it's also true that a game with a high emphasis on items doesn't necessarily mean that they're good. Now, where am I going with all of this? Well, just like not all of these elements are equally present in every game, not every player cares about these equally either. Some people care a lot more about the story than others, for example, and of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. To try to answer the question of what is a real Zelda, there's only one thing I would answer. It's one that will favor the elements you prefer out of those 6. That's it, really. To the people who are saying that Breath of the Wild isn't a real Zelda, it's probably because you would have preferred a game with more emphasis on dungeons and items, and that's totally understandable. It was also the very first game in the series to have less emphasis on both of these elements at the same time. It just focused on elements that maybe didn't really resonate with you as much as those 2. But to go and say that it's not really a Zelda game, I don't know, man, it's kind of a wild thing to say. But see, we arrive at a very strange realization when examining Tears of the Kingdom. Let's look at all these elements one by one again and see how much emphasis has been put in each of them. Dungeons. Just like with Breath of the Wild, this one depends on if you want to include shrines or not. Even if you don't, I'd still say there's some emphasis on them, especially compared to its prequel. You have some locations never seen before in the series, like a flying boat for example, and puzzles and mechanics are different from one another, making each dungeon feel more unique. However, everything you see in a dungeon in this game when it comes to gameplay is something you'll also see in a shrine somewhere, which is why I'm more in the camp of counting them as part of the dungeon content. Story. Oh yeah, Tears definitely puts a lot of emphasis on its story and narrative. Maybe not as much on its individual characters, but definitely on its plot. It's a somewhat involved story that is a lot more complex than most of the other games in the series, and goes much further than Princess Zelda has been kidnapped. Exploration! I mean, do I even have to say anything here? A 3-layered map with a shit ton of side quests everywhere? Yeah, I don't think I need to elaborate any further. Items! 5, debatably 6 abilities if you include the camera, 5 sage powers. This totals 11, which is a higher number of items than many other games in the series. There's also the Earth Scroll, which is worthy of mention even if it sucks ass. This doesn't even include Zonai devices, or every collectible in your inventory that can be used, or armor sets, which you could also make an argument for counting as items. Combat! There are a lot more enemies and bosses present in Tears compared to most other Zelda games, and abilities like Flurry Rush, Bullet Time, and even Fuse are mainly going to be used for combat purposes. I'd say it's one of, if not the most combat-focused game in the series without question. Unique feature: vehicle building and Zonai devices, fusing everything together, the amount of freedom you have, I think they speak for themselves. As we can see, Tears of the Kingdom puts emphasis, not perfectly equally but still, on every core element that defines a Zelda game. So what's the problem? Why are so many people saying that they want a real Zelda again? The answer is honestly very simple. It's because even though Tears puts emphasis on all of these elements, it excels in none of them. There are problems with every one of these elements. Pretty big problems too, that just makes it not a good reference for any of them in the series. The dungeons are all designed in the exact same way. Every single one of them is built around activating terminals, and they must be activating using your companion's abilities. Sure, they look different, but they don't play different almost at all. Not to mention, almost all the shrines are essentially the same, as most of them require the exact same solution to be solved, which is to Ultra Hand some bullshit together to cross gaps or activate switches. What you need to do will be obvious to anyone because everything you need will always be readily available to you right when you enter the place. If they aren't about using Ultra Hand, they will be about using Ascend or Recall, and will also be just as obvious, sometimes even more so. The challenge name of some of these shrines are also sometimes so on the nose that they spoil it for you. And of course, everything is so easy to cheese that a lot of the dungeons and shrines feel really unsatisfying to complete. The story in itself isn't bad when taken as a self-contained narrative. The biggest problem is how it's told and how it feels really disconnected from its prequel, let alone the whole series. It shits on a lot of the established lore, which is honestly something that happens more than people realize when a new Zelda releases, but this one was marketed as a direct sequel, which is why it's more of a problem here. Also, the characters are pretty flat and boring. Some of the most important ones don't even have a face or a name, and the ones we know from the prequel have no personality anymore. Exploration is just boring. The surface is the same map from the prequel, but added useless caves that take ages to destroy its millions of rock walls just to find a booble frog and maybe a blessing or crystal shrine. The sky is copy-pasted everywhere and the depths are an empty wasteland. None of these areas are fun to explore, and the sky even takes away from the surface exploration, as it makes you fill your map with essentially new terminals every time you warp up there and take a look down. Combat feels repetitive and is too easy. The solution to the vast majority of the enemies is the exact same. The only real exceptions are the Gibdos, which are strong against regular attacks but weak to elemental ones. Other than that, most of the enemies are just arrow count checks or flurry rush tests. A lot of bosses are very similar to one another as well, having a very clear and identifiable weak spot that needs to be hit enough times, or again being an arrow count check. Some of the overworld bosses are still fun to fight, and getting a flurry rush is still cool and all, but it's so inconsistent that it can be frustrating. Upgrading your gear also makes combat way too easy, as you just can't die after a while. The items and abilities either break the game open completely or are just tedious to use. The former, of course, being the abilities of Raru's arm, and the latter being the Sage summons. The arm's abilities just do too much and allow you to cheese the whole game, contributing a lot to why some of the dungeons are so disappointing. The Sage powers are just a hassle to use just because of having to find the correct Sage summon, which won't always be next to you when needed, and because of their massive cooldown. And finally, the vehicle building is both game-breaking and not worth exploring at the same time. The hoverbike is the only vehicle you need for everything, and it destroys the game because of how easy it is to make, and it also makes every other vehicle not really worth using. Fuse is almost never useful aside from breaking rock walls and powering up your arrows. These two things also make you spend so much time in menus that they make the iron boots from Ocarina of Time feel like an equipable item in comparison. This is the unfortunate state that Tears of the Kingdom is in. Beyond all of the reused assets of Breath of the Wild, which definitely doesn't help its case, it tries to focus on every single element of a Zelda game at once, but ends up being one which feels like Nintendo didn't really have a clear vision on what they wanted to make. It's a game blending a bunch of ideas that don't really have any synergy together. It's a good example of how a game that tries to appeal to everyone ends up appealing to no one. I could easily give at least one example of a Zelda game that does better than Tears in each of these elements. That said, I could also easily give one example of a game in the series that does worse than Tears in each of these elements. In fact, Tears of the Kingdom doesn't do terrible at any of them, it just doesn't excel anywhere, and in a series filled with excellent games on average such as Zelda, it's gonna stick out more. This is pretty much where I'm at with Tears of the Kingdom. My opinions haven't really changed since the game came out because, well, I haven't really been playing the game all that much. I've done 2 playthroughs and that was it really. I don't feel the need to play it again unless I do another Zelda marathon. I might finish the shrines I haven't on my second playthrough, but I'm not getting all the light roots in the depths again, and I don't want to talk about Koroks. Honestly, for the next Zelda, all I hope is that they have a structure in mind when making it. Out of the first 5 core elements I mentioned regarding these games, being again dungeon, story, exploration, items, and combat, I don't really mind which ones they decide to focus on, as long as they do it well. If they want to focus on story, have a good story. If they want to focus on combat, have fun enemies and bosses to fight. If they want to focus on items, make us want to use them for different situations, and so on. The 6th element, the unique feature, which is definitely the most arbitrary of them all, but it's also the one I think is the most important. It's definitely the one I care about the most. My biggest wish really is that Nintendo makes a game that feels different to play from the others that already exist. I don't want a game that recycles a feature that was an important part of another game's identity just because people liked it, but one that innovates and tries new things. Even with everything I said in this video, I still respect Tears of the Kingdom for the things it tried, even if I wasn't a big fan of those new things. But I believe whether I was a fan or not is something I find irrelevant, as trying new things I think is better than just recycling without trying to innovate almost at all, which some games in the series, even some beloved ones, definitely do. I know I make it sound like the easiest thing in the world, like just make a good game, forehead, but I'm aware it's not. I'm saying those things though because I truly believe Nintendo is still capable of making great games. Compared to a lot of game studios in the past few years, they haven't lost their way yet. I still care and believe enough in the future of this series to want to make this video. Even though I was disappointed with this latest big release, a lot of people seem to like it and is now their favorite Zelda. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you agree or am I tripping again? What would you want to see for the next game? Which of these core Zelda elements do you care about the most? Give me your thoughts in the comments. I will read it, and thanks everyone for watching.